and welcome to this seminar. This is on kidney disease, emerging treatments, and new approaches. Today, we're going to talk about emerging data from EMPA-KIDNEY study. And before starting, I'm Beatriz Fernandez. I will be the moderator for today from Madrid, Spain. And before starting, we are going to challenge our community, our nephrology community, with a poll. I'm going to challenge the audience. So we're going to start with one first question. How many of you are already using SGLT2 inhibitors for non-diabetic CKD patients? So I want you to answer if yes, I'm using them sometimes, or not, still not using them on non-diabetic population. So let's vote. Let me check, yes, I'm using them, it's 60%, sometimes it's 24%, and no, still not using them is about 16%. So we're going to do another two questions before we are going to introduce, before that, we're going to introduce our panelists and our speaker for today. Today, we're counting with Professor Will Herrington. Will Herrington is a clinician scientist. He's based in the University of Oxford. He's also associate professor, and he's a honorary consultant nephrologist in Oxford Kidney Unit. And he led the EMPA-KIDNEY trial, which is going to present today. Hello, Will, and welcome. And then we will have a nice discussion within the results, questions, comments arising from the audience and from us with Professor Katharina Schütt. She is a senior consultant in cardiology at the University of Aachen in Germany, and she is heading the heart failure unit at the Department of Cardiology. She's got a long-standing research in cardiovascular disease and diabetes chronic kidney disease. Welcome, Katharina. And we're going to talk to Rikke Borg. She is a consultant in nephrology and internal medicine and still in University Hospital in the Netherlands, in Denmark. And she is leader of clinical research unit and associate professor at the University of Copenhagen. So welcome, Rikke. And before starting with Professor Herrington's talk, we're going to do another two questions for the audience. We're challenging you today. And the second one and third one will be done now and after the end, before the end of the session. So as if we can check if you change your mind or maybe not. So second question will be, how far do you go on eGFR when using SGLT2 inhibitors? First will be, I won't go below 45 milliliters per minute. Second will be, I won't go below 30 milliliters per minute. Third will be, I won't go below 20 milliliters per minute. And the last one will be, I will go until the patient starts renal replacement therapy. So let's vote. Wow, 99%, 45, 25, 29, and 36. Okay, it's like quite challenging, this one. All right, so let us check if we change your mind or not. And the third one. So let's go for the question number 3. And it's here it is. So could you use SGLT2 inhibitors in patients with low or normal albuminuria? But of course, should be the first one. The second one will depending on all the factors, young people, genetic background, metabolic syndrome. Or number 3, no. Its usefulness and has not been demonstrated in randomized controlled trials. You can vote. All right, it's 37, 40% depending, or 23% no. So we will check if you changed your mind or not after the session. So now we're going to present the results. Professor Herrington is going to present the results on EMPA-KIDNEY emerging data.
Thank you so much to the ERA for the opportunity to present these data again, and some additional data which was not presented when these results were shown to the American Society of Nephrology earlier this month. I am presenting on behalf of the EMPA-KIDNEY Collaborative Group, which is a steering committee of experts, as well as the trialists who conducted the trial in Oxford. Now, the trial was initiated by Oxford University. We conducted the trial as well as designed it and analysed it, and we've reported it with the steering committee. So it's quite different, I think, to a lot of trials of this size, but it was funded and was sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim, but also by Lilly. I get personal support from Kidney Research UK and the UK government, and we don't accept honoraria. So EMPA-KIDNEY was envisaged, and the design was first penciled out back in 2016, actually after the results of the EMPA-REG outcome trial. And without the knowledge of the results, obviously, of credence, we knew that the trial was ongoing. We didn't know the existence of DAPA-CKD at all. And then it was submitted to various funders, and we were very pleased that Boehringer Ingelheim took on the challenge of working with an academic collaboration. It was registered in 2018 after regulatory review. And then obviously since then, history has rather changed. We've now got with EMPA-KIDNEY 13 large trials, and we'll put the results of EMPA-KIDNEY into the context of all these at the end. But what we wanted to do and what we set out in 2016 was we wanted to assess the effects of SGLT2 inhibition in a broad range of patients. We wanted to study at least 6,000 patients, and we want to identify patients at risk of progression. And we want to include people with and without diabetes. And these were the very simple inclusion criteria that we set out. It was either at screening or historically an EGFR between 20 and 45, or an EGFR between 45 and 90 in the presence of a marker of progression risk, which was an albumin-creatinine ratio of at least 200 milligrams per gram, which for those of you who work in milligrams per millimole is 22.6. And we wanted to make it broadly generalizable, and so we tried to exclude the minimum number of patients that we could, but we did have to exclude patients with polycystic kidney disease, and we did exclude patients with a kidney transplant. And we required participants to be at their screening visit on what the investigators would need to have judged to be clinically appropriate renin-angiotensin system use, inhibitor use, but we did include patients if RAS inhibitors were not indicated in their opinion or not tolerated. And then patients were randomized 1-to-1 to empagliflozin 10 milligrams once daily versus a matching placebo. And the plan was to follow until 1,070 participants had had one of the primary outcomes, giving us reasonable power for an 18% relative risk reduction. And the primary composite was a composite of cardiovascular death and kidney disease progression. And kidney disease progression itself was defined as end-stage kidney disease, that's what it was known as back then, as dialysis or transplantation or death essentially from kidney failure, or some EGFR-based outcomes, a sustained decline in EGFR to less than 10, so serious kidney failure, or at least 40% EGFR decline, with sustained defined as being measured on 2 consecutive visits or the last scheduled visit. And we've reported our baseline characteristics in the ERA journal, NDT, with more information about primary kidney diagnosis is in the New England Journal. So it's a paper still worth reading, despite the fact the latest results are out in the New England Journal. But the baseline age was 64, about a third were women. About a half, just over, did not have diabetes at the point of randomization. And the mean EGFR was the lowest of the CKD trials at 37, with about a third with an EGFR less than 30. Median UACR was also the lowest of the CKD trials at about 330 milligrams per gram. And that meant we nearly had half of the cohort with A1 or A2 levels of albuminuria. And we included a wide range of types of causes of kidney disease. Only 31% had diabetic kidney disease, about 25%, so a quarter, had glomerular disease, just under a quarter, 22%, had ischemic or hypertensive disease, 12% had other causes, and 10% was about unknown. And 85% of participants were on a RAS inhibitor. And the trial obviously randomized 1-to-1 and was following up patients until it was reported by the Independent Data Monitoring Committee that we had met the 2 conditions for stopping. And that was reported to us on the 7th of March this year. And we completed follow-up on the 5th of July. during which time we had accrued a median follow-up time of 2 years. The median follow-up time is 2 years, but we did have a large part of the trial recruited early, then a whole period of COVID-19 where recruitment had to stop, and then a large part recruited later. So there is some variation in the median follow-up, and the interquartile range is 1.5 to 2.4 years. But despite COVID, we managed to keep the vast majority of participants on study treatment, and it was well tolerated. About 90% of participants at the study midpoint at 12 months reported taking most of their study treatment. And by final follow-up, less than 1% of participants in both arms had started an open-label SGLT2 inhibitor. So our estimates of effect are good estimates of effect. They're not affected by poor adherence. And this was the primary outcome. This primary outcome occurred in 558 patients allocated to placebo, 432 allocated to empagliflozin, a highly statistically significant 28% relative risk reduction in the primary outcome. That confidence interval spans from 18% to 36%, and the p-value has actually at least another 0 on. We only show you 5 zeros. And there were 990 primary outcomes, but actually 888 participants had kidney disease progression. This was a cohort selected for risk of progression, and that's what we were really studying. And you can see the result here of just the kidney disease progression components of the primary, so a clear 29% relative risk reduction. And those humps are essentially the points at which you start seeing patients. We only saw patients at 6 monthly intervals, and there was a clear benefit apparent at 12 months, but of course we hadn't seen them for 6 months. So that's why it looks like a ski slope as you go down. But the cardiovascular death rate, which looks much more like straight lines, was much lower than we were expecting, perhaps because of secular trends. So changes in mortality rates over time, but also inclusion of patients from Japan, which we hadn't done in previous trials. And the hazard ratio was a non-significant result, but it is consistent with the totality of the evidence, which you'll see later. So just low numbers of events here. But if you combine cardiovascular death with a hard clinical outcome of needing to start dialysis or receive a transplant, then we still saw a very clear reduction in that risk of those hard clinical outcomes by 27%. We had 3 key subgroup analyses. We do present many more, but you really need to pre-specify in your data analysis plan the subgroups you're really interested in, and these were the 3 we selected and pre-specified, and the first was by diabetes. And this was the one that has been stressing me out because I wanted to make sure we had clear evidence of efficacy in both those with and without diabetes. And I wasn't sure exactly how many outcomes we would have in the 2 strata by the end of the trial. But I was really pleased that we had 990 outcomes in the end. We planned 1,070. We nearly got to that point, but we were able to demonstrate clear evidence of efficacy in people with and without diabetes. So the overall result, the 28% relative risk reduction, is shown in that diamond, and the box and whiskers show you the results in the 2 subgroups. But the most important thing to look at actually is the heterogeneity p-value at the bottom, which is non-significant, which says that that there isn't a statistical difference between the 2 groups, and that we should be using the 28% overall relative risk reduction as the best estimate for people in with or without diabetes. But I was even more pleased with this result. We've got over 500 outcomes in people with EGFR less than 30, which turned out to be the group which has been most understudied by the time EMPA-KIDNEY reports. And you can see again, the p-value at the bottom, 0.78, is non-significant, clear evidence of benefit across the full range of EGFRs. And those EGFRs less than 30 are the ones which I think a lot of us as nephrologists see. And this is where the data was really missing. And it was really in 2016 when we set up the design of this trial, the question we wanted to address for our community. And so this is a really pleasing result. And it really shows that these drugs, despite the fact they attenuate effect on glycosuria, still have this clear preserved effect on the nephron. So they're working at a single nephron level. It's not dependent on total EGFR. And we've had lots of questions about what about those really low EGFRs? And I'm going to throw in a naughty post hoc analysis. So this wasn't pre-specified, but we have had a look at the patients with an EGFR between 15 and 20. So the trial had a run-in period. So there was between 6 and 15 weeks between screening when they were eligible and randomization. And as a result, some of the EGFRs would have progressed below 20 by the time they actually received their study treatment. And you can see that we had 250 patients with EGFRs between 15 and 20, over 100 outcomes. And again, the p-value for trend is exactly the same. It looks like it's really consistent in effect, even below the levels that we specified as inclusion. And here's the third subgroup, which is where the data starts to run thin. And this is by baseline level of albuminuria. And what you can see here overall in the diamond is the 28% relative risk reduction. And below that is the trend p-value of 0.02, which is a statistical evidence that there are larger benefits in patients with higher levels of albuminuria. And you can see there's only 84 outcomes in those with A1 levels. But we're going to come back to this subgroup because we've been exploring this a bit more because it's such an important subgroup. We may be able to generate more evidence by looking at slope analyses in subgroups where we've got low numbers of events. This is on Twitter, people wanted to know this result. So here's the result by RAS inhibitor use. There are a series of other pre-specified subgroup analyses in the supplement of the New England Journal paper. But here's one of the people in nephrology were interested in on Twitter. So again, consistent results, whether or not you're on a RAS inhibitor or not at baseline. So EGFR slope analyses is where we explored the albuminuria subgroup. And I think we're beginning to get more familiar with these as a community. It's developed really with the FDA and EMA in a workshop by the CKD Prognosis Consortium, CKD-EPI Consortium, who generated a lot of observational and trial data. And they've been able to, from a large data sets, been able to reliably show that an EGFR slope reduction of a 0.5 to 1 mil per year translates into what is clinically meaningful and predict quite a large relative risk reduction on kidney disease progression if trials were long enough. So in actual fact, about a 0.7 mil per minute per year reduction would equate normally to about a 30% relative risk reduction on kidney disease progression if a trial carried on for long enough. This is a really important bit of background information to know, because here is the EGFR slope results from EMPA-KIDNEY. So this is the chronic slope, and what's plotted is the placebo group slope over time, which was 2.75 mils per minute per year. Here's the acute dip in nephrology we all recognize with these agents. And here is the chronic slope, which was slow to 1.37. Okay, so the absolute difference, which is what we always quote here, this isn't a relative reduction. There's an absolute difference is 1.37 mils per minute per year. On a relative scale, this is about a halving of risk. So if the trial was to go on for 10 years, the relative risk reduction might actually be a halving of risk. We estimated a 28% risk reduction, but the slopes might predict we would see much larger effects. And now this is how we assess the effect in people with and without albuminuria. So this is the exact same result, but turned into a forest plot. So the diamond at the bottom is that 1.37 mil per minute difference. And you can then see on the left the rate in those with empagliflozin in pink and placebo in blue. And in the box is the rate of progression by different levels of albuminuria. And you can see that at A1 levels, progression was just under 1 mil per minute per year. And at those with A3 levels of albuminuria, it was over 4. So a good spread, and just as what you would predict. And then this is the slopes in people with empagliflozin. So it's slowed to 0.11 mils, almost arrested decline in people with A1 levels of albuminuria, and about halved the rate of decline in people with A3 levels. And so you can see the absolute differences plotted on the right. So you can actually slow progression by about 0.78 mils per minute per year. Pretty impressive in the normal albuminuric group, the A1 levels, and by 1.76 in the greater than 300 group. So evidence that there was slowing of change of kidney function over time, but perhaps again evidence of larger effects, at least on an absolute scale this time, not on a relative scale, in patients with higher levels of albuminuria. So we had to think about more than just the kidney, though. We were studying cardiovascular disease and other outcomes, and we had key secondary outcomes, which are based on non-kidney outcomes, and here they are. So the first thing to point out is one of these three was statistically significant. So all-cause hospitalization occurred in just over 3,500 people. over the course of the trial, and there's a 14% risk reduction in hospitalization for any cause, and that was a general pattern across all causes. It wasn't something specific like vascular disease. We saw it across all causes of hospitalization. There were still low event rates for hospitalization for heart failure, cardiovascular death, and also death through any cause. And actual fact, those were not significant statistically, but again, these are completely in line with what you see from the totality of the evidence. And then safety, this is incredibly important. We know a lot about SGLT2 inhibitors because they've been studied in 90,000 patients. We didn't learn much new here. We didn't find anything new in terms of safety outcomes. They were broadly well tolerated, and the safety profile was sort of what we would have expected. So you can see that there was an expected excess of ketoacidosis, 6 versus 1. 1 occurred in a patient with type 1 diabetes. We had 68 such patients in the trial. 4 occurred in people with type 2 diabetes, and we did have 1 patient without diabetes who had ketoacidosis, but it wasn't diabetic ketoacidosis, of course. It was starvation ketoacidosis, and they had to do quite a lot to get on well enough to get ketoacidosis, and it was rather mild and resolved rather quickly. So really 6 versus 1 for ketoacidosis, about what we were expecting. And then the other serious adverse events, there's no significant differences. And overall, actually serious adverse events, there was a very slight reduction in all serious adverse events overall. And then you see the lower limb amputations. Canvas has drawn a lot of attention to this, but we had 28 versus 19, and just over half of them were toe amputations. So these are not major lower limb amputations. They're toe amputations, and they're nearly always in patients with diabetes. So this is the summary of EMPA-KIDNEY. So 6,609 patients with CKD, a broad range of causes, large numbers with low levels of kidney function and with low levels of albuminuria, selected for being at risk of progression. And empagliflozin really safely reduced the composite primary outcome by 28%. We saw that these benefits on a relative scale, this 28% reduction, was consistent in patients with and without diabetes and across the full range of eGFR studied. I said in the presentation at least down to 20, because I already seen the post-hoc analyses. I think we can defend that at least down to 20. And the slope analyses suggest that although the benefits on kidney disease progression appear larger in people with higher levels of albuminuria, we do see, benefits on progression in all subgroups. So that was what we presented at the ASN, but we didn't leave the stage at that point because we wanted to put these results in the context of all of the trials. There's an enormous amount of information, and in fact, these slides are available to you if you want to download them from our website. But there is more information that will be provided at the conference. So I'm going to carry on a bit. You thought I was about to end. What we also did was, whilst we had the results of EMPA-KIDNEY cooking and we knew the trial was finishing early, we collaborated with the other trialists, which had formed a group called SMART-C, and collected individual trials analyses for kidney disease progression and acute kidney injury, so that we could put the results of EMPA-KIDNEY into the totality of the evidence when it reported. And I was stressed, as I told you, about the effects in people with and without diabetes. I thought that was going to be the most important question we were addressing in EMPA-KIDNEY. And so we specifically did a meta-analysis looking at the impact of diabetes on kidney outcomes. And so we collected data from all of these 13 large trials that have reported, information on kidney disease progression. We didn't include the trials of SGLT2 inhibitors in COVID, and there was one large trial which studied people with type 1 diabetes, but it was only a year, so it doesn't provide us with information on the outcomes we were interested in. And the key feature of the meta-analysis from our point of view was that we standardized the kidney disease progression outcome to a 50% sustained eGFR decline. Credence used 57%, EMPA-KIDNEY used 40%, CKD used 50%. We merged them all together so we could compare the data and aggregate it in a reliable fashion. And because we're kidney doctors, we're obsessed by the kidney, and we've seen, you know, these reliable assessments of safety in terms of acute kidney injury from all the other trials. We actually assess that as well. But I think this is quite important. Acute kidney injury, we're beginning to realize it may well be an efficacy outcome. And so we've considered this efficacy for this meta-analysis, although we did include other safety outcomes. And as I said, the main reason for doing it was to compare the effects in people with and without diabetes, but we were able to also look at a few other things. And I knew that people would be interested in IgA nephropathy, and we really wanted to get that data into the community as quickly as possible. So we also specified to look at primary kidney diagnosis in this meta-analysis as well. So how did we define these outcomes? Well, as I said, kidney disease progression with a sustained 50% eGFR decline, the usual additions of maintenance dialysis or kidney transplant, death from kidney failure. And we used a sustained low eGFR. We had to use slightly different criteria by different trials. If you're studying a very low eGFR population, you pick out 10, like an EMPA-KIDNEY, but the majority of the other trials used 15. And then to try and standardize the information on acute kidney injury that's been appearing, what we did was we used, wherever it was possible, the specific MEDRA, that's the regulatory coding system, of a specific MEDRA term for acute kidney injury. The vast majority of the trials are not adjudicated. EMPA-KIDNEY is, but we did collect acute kidney injury and focused on that. And here are the 13 trials. 4 in type 2 diabetes and high cardiovascular risk, 5 in heart failure, 4 in CKD. And you can see the range of eGFRs studied. You can see that there are now 16,000 patients without diabetes studied, 5,000 in patients with CKD, just over nearly 11,000 in people with heart failure, and a total of just over 90,000. So beginning to get really good information in people without diabetes. And this was the kidney disease progression result overall, a pretty impressive result, something I don't think any of us would have dreamed about 6 or 7 years ago, a drug which can reduce risk of kidney disease progression by nearly 40%. We'd never seen this before, I don't think, in nephrology. And what's even more startling is we now know that these effects are similar in people with and without diabetes on a relative scale. There's a few more details that are in the paper comparing all the trials at a different level, but I'm not going to show those today. We might come back to them if the questions arise. Because I think this is what I was really interested in seeing from the meta-analysis, was the results by kidney disease diagnosis. And diabetic kidney disease was studied intensively in the early CKD trials. I've popped SCORED in there as well, which was really a cardiovascular outcome trial, but it obviously was in CKD patients, but the result is the same. It's about a 40% relative risk reduction if you include SCORED or if you don't. So below is the effects in non-diabetic causes of kidney disease. And what you could see is if we divide them up into what have been used in the trials of ischemic and hypertensive disease, glomerular disease, and other diseases, then you see that the results are roughly consistent with each other. There's no really good evidence of differences of treatment by these wide range of categories. So that was quite reassuring as well. And it makes life easy for us, I think, because it's very clear that they've got glomerular inflammation that might be the initiating factor in your CKD, that there is still a progression factor with SGLT2 inhibitors, target and slow risk of progression. And of course, you will all probably have been reading the results of the sub-analyses from DAPA-CKD, and one of the interesting ones was this very large effect on IgA nephropathy, perhaps larger than you would expect, and I thought maybe too good to be true. But if you look at the EMPA-KIDNEY result, where we had 817 patients with IgA nephropathy, and we could add meaningfully to the numbers of outcomes, I think we had about 80, then you start to see that now we've got 105 outcomes overall in that group of people with such a common glomerular disease, and it does look like overall there are benefits of SGLT2 inhibitors. So if you're a single disease nephrologist, here is very good evidence that the new standard of care might exist for patients with IgA nephropathy. Really very few events in people with FSGS, which is a shame, but I think we will explore this a bit more with slope analyses. That's the only way of getting into the nitty-gritty of single causes of kidney disease. Acute kidney injury, as I say, I think is important. I think these drugs do more than just lower intraglomerular hypertension. And what's amazing is that overall you get a 23% relative risk reduction. It's consistent whether you have diabetes or not. It's true if you've got heart failure on your series of drugs like diuretics, beta blockers, and RAS inhibitors. It's true if you're not. So a really rather important finding, and really very different to RAS inhibitors and what the experience we saw with combining two RAS inhibitors. Really unexpected, I think, as well. I think this is a really important result. And then cardiovascular disease, this is the overall result for cardiovascular death or hospitalization for heart failure, a 23% relative risk reduction. The vast majority of outcomes in people without diabetes are from the heart failure trials, not from the CKD trials. There's really very little data on cardiovascular benefits in people without diabetes from either DAPA-CKD or EMPA-KIDNEY. This result is driven by the heart failure trials that are showing benefit in preserved and reduced ejection fraction heart failure, irrespective of diabetes status. And then here are the two main safety outcomes that have been the focus of attention. Ketoacidosis, really very low event rates in the trials, but there is a clear effect, a clear doubling of risk, a doubling of a low risk to a low risk, but still a risk, and we should be aware of it, particularly these unusual euglycemic presentations. And then lower limb amputation, the hypothesis raised by Canvas, where there was a doubling of risk, hasn't been confirmed by the other 12 trials combined. There may well be an amputation risk, but it is small, and it really is confined to patients with diabetes. As far as we can see so far, there's been 25 amputations only in patients without diabetes, and it's 12 versus 13. So not something I worry about when I'm starting this treatment in patients without diabetes. And we turn this into some absolute benefit bar charts. People love numbers needed to treat, but what we always fail to point out when you do numbers needed to treat is how many people for how long. This is a much better way of doing it, absolute effects per 1,000 patient years. So here are some bar charts. On the left, people with diabetes, on the right, people without. And this uses the event rates from the CKD trials. We've done similar plots like this in a publication for people with heart failure and similar plots for people with generally preserved kidney function. But you can see that in the trials that have been studied, that for 1 year only, 1,000 patients treated, we prevent 11 kidney disease progression outcomes in people with diabetes and 15 in people without. We prevent acute kidney injury meaningfully, and also reduce hospitalization for heart failure, particularly in people with diabetes. That's quite important. In terms of the harms, I mean, people without diabetes is almost not worth speaking about. People with diabetes, if you look at the numbers of people with who get ketoacidosis and amputations, then there is a small excess, but the benefits, if you were to add up the 3 bar charts on the left, far exceed the turquoise and purple on the right. Very reassuring, I think, for us. So the conclusions from the meta-analysis were that SGLT2 inhibitors safely reduce the risk of kidney disease progression and acute kidney injury, really irrespective of diabetes status. We also show that they weren't modified by EGFR, importantly, by primary kidney diagnoses in those 4 big buckets, and the absolute benefits exceeded the harms. And I mustn't finish any talk without saying thank you to the participants who we are deeply indebted to for battling through COVID-19 and staying on study treatment and giving us so many blood samples, but also to the collaborators who are from 8 countries. I'm now open for questions, and I look forward to discussing these findings with you.
Thank you very much. There are lots of questions here in the Q&A, and we're going to start. I'm going to start asking you on the panelists, of course. What do you think? Are you surprised about the kidney disease progression? Are you surprised about the primary outcomes in terms of kidney disease progression and in terms of secondary outcomes as well in cardiovascular and all-cause mortality? I would like you to talk about that.
When I saw the results of DAPA-CKD, I fell off my chair. The effects on kidney disease progression are really remarkable. I thought maybe the effects on non-diabetic kidney disease were too good to be true. And I'm so pleased that we've managed to replicate and find the same thing, because this is going to be transformative, I think, for nephrology practice. The result for non-diabetics, we can be really confident now. They're going to be grade 1A recommendations in our specialty, which is fabulous news. And also we can now start to use it really confidently, even at the later stages. Our patients that get to our kidney clinics, they're at the highest risk, they progress the furthest. And you would have, in 2014, I was the skeptic. I thought there's no way these drugs could work at low levels of EGFR. It wasn't until I saw the results of EMPA-KIDNEY outcome and the fact it wasn't modified by EGFR that we thought that we could be studying much lower levels of EGFR. We never thought we'd get 28% relative risk reductions. You see, we powered the trial for an 18% relative risk reduction. I still thought that was a punt. I thought we were maybe underpowered even at that stage. So I never fathomed we might see these effects. And I never fathomed an EGFR slope analysis where we were halving the rate of kidney progression.
That's true. So what do you think about that, Rikke?
Well, just thank you for your presentation, Will. What a great job you've done. And I must say, I'm also really enjoying these numbers. I think EMPA-KIDNEY is just filling out the little gaps we had left in the large body of evidence. I think the whole way these drugs has turned around the rationale of thinking in diabetes has been great. We see them, this whole organ protection view instead of just focusing on glucose. But for the non-diabetic populations, which are in our hearts also as nephrologists, this is just great news. And that we can get more news from the glomerulonephritis and the IgA again, it's great. And also, I think it helps us also to look at the non-diabetic patients in the way we've done with the diabetes patients, that we need to think organ protection outside the kidney as well, also in these groups. And the focus on heart failure and cardiovascular death and so on just enhances the focus on this.
Katharina, this is a cardiologist. This is a cardiologist today in the room. So what do you think about that? What do you think about these secondary outcomes? There are some questions actually from the audience about that. Why do you think it's a different? They got different outcomes. They don't have like this all-cause mortality that I would love to see. And what do you think? This is a little bit different, or just the difference between HF trials and CKD trials?
First of all, I'd like to congratulate Will to this very well conducted and impressive study. I really like the data. And looking at the cardiovascular endpoints, as you said, as a cardiologist, I'm very pleased, because I think it's the study population which is a bit different if we compare to DEPA-CKD. Will just explained at the very beginning that they had these combined endpoint with CV death and the kidney endpoints. And it was endpoint driven, and it was more easy to conduct the kidney endpoints with a 40% reduction of EGFR than having cardiovascular death. And the other point is, if you compare to DEPA-CKD, they had more patients with albuminuria. So it was 3 times higher compared to EMPA-KIDNEY. And we know from a cardiologist's view, there are old papers, maybe 10 years or so ago, showing that you have albuminuria, that your risk to die from cardiovascular disease is much higher. So it's 4-fold higher if you have both a low EGFR and albuminuria, and it's, I think, 2-fold higher if you have albuminuria alone. So the group with no albuminuria just have a lower cardiovascular risk compared to those with a higher albuminuria. And if you just look at the cardiovascular death, and it was something Will highlighted during his presentation, it's pretty much the same as in DEPA-CKD. So it's, I think, 0.81 and 0.84. So it's nearly the same. So we really think it's a class effect we see here. And I'm really pleased with the data.
That's good in it. And I've got like a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to try to like put those in groups because there are lots of them. So this Professor Gorit asked you about related to EMPA-KIDNEY study results don't show p-value for heterogeneity for subgroup analysis of primary endpoint for albuminuria. Do we know It doesn't appear in the article or in the slides. That's Professor Gorit's question. And that goes like related to this, like such a lot of questions on albuminuria about this data that's supporting giving the SGLT2 inhibitors in the absence of albuminuria. So maybe you should explain a little bit about that. Thank you, Will.
Yes.
Or maybe.
So I think the point about not seeing the HET tests and trend tests, I'm really sorry, but we really work hard behind the scenes to have these data provided. The reason it's not in the New England Journal paper is simply it's journal style and it's a rigid rule. But what we have done is on the EMPA-KIDNEY website, we put the slides out for you, which have all of the HET tests and trend tests in them, so you can see them. If you want to know, I think the specific question was asking about the HET tests on trend tests for the chronic and the total slope analyses. They will all be very positive for the absolute differences, but that could be driven by the fact that there are very different absolute rates behind it. So the HET tests are not just a HET test that tests the effect of treatment. They're also looking at heterogeneity by baseline rate. What we're doing is doing some more analysis at the moment, and we'll publish it with all of the trend tests and HET tests, where we also look at the relative benefits. So you want to see how much the slope changes in an absolute scale, but you also want to see how much it changes on a relative scale. So it might change by 1 or 2 mils per minute per year. That's an absolute scale, but it might actually reduce by 30 or 40 or 50%. That's the relative scale. And I think you need to see those two numbers next to each other and then do HET tests on those to be able to really understand how these drugs work and if there are really differences between subgroups. And so we're working on that for you at the moment.
They're asking as well about the EMPA-KIDNEY, the eGFR slope curves. They cross later in EMPA-KIDNEY, the other studies as DAPA-CKD or credence. What do you think is the explanation of this differences?
Where they cross is really dependent on the rate of progression. The dip is slightly different by level of EGFR or level of albuminuria, but if you're progressing at a slower rate, it takes longer for you to get all of that EGFR back. So EMPA-KIDNEY was lower risk than the other trials because of the fact it had half of the population with low levels of albuminuria. So that's the main reason for that. So I'll tell you what we're doing at the moment is, because we were a low risk cohort and we managed to treat people for 2 years, but we were stopped early, and we knew there'd be some patients who were progressing at a slow rate, and we want to try and get more data on them. We're actually following patients up for another 2 years, observing them. They're not having study treatment, but we're observing what happens to their clinical outcomes for kidney disease progression. And so we'll be able to do more slope analyses, but also look at those categorical outcomes and count people starting dialysis over time. We'll be able to assess the effects of 2 years of treatment over 4 years. I think that will start to be quite informative, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the results. And I'm so grateful to the collaborators for carrying on the trial for an extra 2 years.
Can I just ask you, Will, in EMPA-REG outcome, they had this, I think, 2 weeks follow-up without a drug. Did you have that in EMPA-KIDNEY so that you could see the GFR actually return even more benefit?
Yes, so we did that just in the UK, and just in a subset. We measured albuminuria and we measured EGFR again, just in about 800 patients. We haven't reported the results yet. But it does flip back up. But in actual fact, what we're going to see actually with the full post-trial follow-up is the EGFR slope analysis is going to look a bit funny, because you're going to have the dip and then you're going to have a little jump up again, and then you're going to have a progression. But we'll be able to do some calculations with it. So we'll be able to do it much better once we've got all of the post-trial follow-up data. Yeah, but it does return somewhat up, and we do get some change in albuminuria, as you would expect.
So thank you. Before coming with a lot of glomerulonephritis questions in EMPA-KIDNEY, I'm going to say just one question about this. Rita Byrne that asked, why did EMPA-KIDNEY give up on including patients with type 1 diabetes? It was because of ketoacidosis, and she said, what a loss of opportunity. So why did it stop?
Yeah, so the funder requested us to stop recruiting patients. When we first designed the trial, I didn't include people with type 1 diabetes. I was worried about ketoacidosis. The funder encouraged us to do it, and we found a way to do it. They all required ketone meters. So only a few sites were able to recruit these patients because they were able to provide ketone meters. So there is a risk of ketoacidosis, as you know, and the rates in people with type 1 diabetes are much higher, maybe 10 times higher. And so the absolute harms could be higher. We wanted to study them and we got them into the trial, but then development of SGLT2 inhibitors across the board, across all of the manufacturers was stopped, and it was part of that required us to stop including them in the protocol. So we've got 68 patients in. We've still got slope analyses on them. I'm really grateful for them volunteering. Actually, it was safe in that group. It's a shame we couldn't have recruited more. Easy in hindsight. And slope analyses will come and we'll show you what the results were soon.
Right. Thank you for the answer. So let's go. There are lots of questions about glomerulonephritis. So they're asking about what about other glomerulonephritis included. We are going to talk about later about IgA nephropathy, which are like the best thing ever. But what about membranous nephropathy, lupus, ANCA vasculitis? You're asking about glomerulonephritis patients' characteristics, including in the study. And they want to know a little bit more about the other ones different, that IgA nephropathy, and why no nephrotic patients were included. And talking about like the same, they want to know if you can have some comment on efficacy and safety on patients with glomerulonephritis on maintenance immunosuppression, like again ANCA vasculitis, lupus nephritis with residual proteinuria. I think this is mostly like about the same questions, like a lot of questions like related in this one.
We'll answer the question, but it will be short, and I might ask Rikke or Katharina what they're doing in their page. So the answer is that we haven't explored any of that data yet. If you look at the overall result of the trial, a 28% relative reduction, it was consistent across all the subgroups we test apart from the albuminuria one, where the results suggested the effects were larger in people with high levels of albuminuria. To be able to investigate all of those diseases, the pet diseases we as nephrologists like, is going to need us to do some EGFR slope analyses. But the best interpretation of the evidence at the moment is the overall effect. And also look at the safety evidence. There are obviously all these people are in there, and we've got really good evidence that these drugs are just as well tolerated in people with low levels of EGFR and with CKD. And what was nice about EMPA-KIDNEY is we did include a wide range of people, including people on immunosuppression. That was because we began to see data from transplant patients from small trials suggesting it was well tolerated and the fears of infections weren't there. So we did include them. The only people that were excluded were patients with a prednisolone dose of more than 45 milligrams per day, or on intravenous immunosuppression. Otherwise, we had other people could be randomized, but we haven't explored that data yet. I know you're interested, but okay. I think the overall result is the most reassuring one. So I don't know what other people are starting to do with these drugs. I'm not going to, I'll pass over to Rikke maybe.
Yeah, well,
this is what we're going to be discussing for months, I guess. The groups are small, of course. We do a lot of extrapolation as nephrologists. We're used to that because our patients are usually excluded from studies. The transplantation patients, we're talking a lot about that, why they shouldn't benefit from this treatment. But I think maybe for now, just be happy that we've covered a really huge amount of our patients. If we have evidence here to go down in the albuminuria degrees, that will be discussed, of course, also in the time to come. I think we have a great deal of people to give this treatment to for now, and then we'll be more clever as time passes and so on. But I would like to ask you, Will, do you think the EMPA-KIDNEY provides enough data for these albuminuria groups? Because that is what people are discussing. So do you think this p-value is enough, and the slope?
So I tell you what. So I think a regulator would look at this and be able to say, look, the drugs work. The question for us as clinicians and particularly people that pay for these drugs is it cost effective? And I think that's the question which hasn't been answered yet. So what we saw was 1 ml per minute per year, roughly, almost aging levels of progression in our well-traded paper even with advanced CKD. And whether or not that's important or not is partly down to discussions between the patients, and whether or not it's cost effective is down to how fast they're progressing. But if you've got an eGFR of 30 and you're 50 years old and you're progressing at 1 ml per minute per year, you're going to want to try and slow it still. And then certainly I'll be using it in my patients where they will clearly benefit. And I think we just need to work out when it is cost saving, because it will be cost saving because of reduced hospitalizations and reduced dialysis, when it is cost effective, and where it might not be cost effective. And I think that work needs to be done. But my suspicion is that the types of patients in EMPA-KIDNEY with low eGFRs without albuminuria, this will be an important treatment. And I just wanted to add that someone said to me, but what about aging of the kidney? We can't modify that. But I think we need to start to dispel the myth that everyone has sort of aging kidney which progresses at 1 ml per minute per year. I don't think that should call that an aging kidney. I think kidneys wear out over time, particularly if we've got CKD. And I don't think we should think of it as aging, because that's not modifiable. What we're seeing now is it really is modifiable. And EMPA-KIDNEY, if it's right that it's a 0.1 ml per minute per year decline, we've stopped aging of the kidney almost.
But that's a very important thing, because if you can stop aging of the kidney, then people won't get to RRT. They won't go to dialysis. So dialysis is not the goal of the patient. The patient is like not start dialysis, and also not dying because of cardiovascular disease. You didn't see cardiovascular mortality because it was like the patients were like a little better, and those patients they got better. Being treated with SGLT2 inhibition. That's it. It's like what it's been done in HF or in cardiology randomized clinical trials. I think you've seen that, Katharina.
Can I ask Katharina a question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So I just want to know how early people are using SGLT2 inhibitors now in patients with cardiovascular disease. I know we saw the data with atherosclerotic disease initially, but it's really quite impressive for heart failure. How early are these treatments being used in patients with heart failure, if they have CKD or they don't have CKD? Is it still a last or a middle line treatment, or is it becoming first line SGLT2 inhibitors?
It really changed over time, and it's now first line therapy in heart failure. So in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, it's really first line. And now we have the data for heart failure with preserved and mid-range reduced ejection fraction. And then we're also using SGLT2 inhibitors. And seeing the kidney data, I feel really good to use it in all the patients with CKD. So having patients with, as Will just showed the data, with the eGFR below 20. So the cutoff for treating in heart failure is an eGFR of 20. So that's what we usually do. So, but I feel like, okay, I can use SGLT2 inhibitors even below the 20 and I'm still safe. And this is the message I take home with me and say, okay, it's for everyone, every of my patients treating or having heart failure, and I can be relaxed about the kidney.
That's great. That's one message. I think I would love to have one message for each of you to take home today. So let's go with Rikke.
I think my favorite number is actually the 0.77, the risk reduction for AKI, because I think as nephrologists, what we're really scared about when we turn up the RAS blockage and we turn up the SGLT2 and we're worried about volume depletion, but now we have 90,000 people in randomized control trials in that meta-analysis showing that actually people do not worsen acutely. And I think that's just a great message. And also for safety, that we can now say when 90,000, all the non-diabetic patients, there are no amputations, there are no ketoacidosis. Those are just great news.
Those are great numbers, actually.
It is.
I'm going to cheat and not use a number. I nearly always state numbers. I'm just going to say, look, we need to thank the nephrology community and all the patients, because we're not catching up with cardiology. We're following in their shadow, but we've managed to randomize 6,600 patients in 8 countries. We could randomize twice that amount. We could generate really large scale, reliable evidence in future trials. If we grasp uncertainty, we do what we did in EMPA-KIDNEY, fantastic collaborators who kept patients on study treatment in follow-up and provided such reliable results for us and the patients, which will transform how we manage people. We can see people with certainty now, having been uncertain. We should encourage more uncertainty as we ask new questions, and we can hopefully have a speciality with the luxurious amount of randomized evidence that cardiologists have in the next decade.
That's true. That's true. Katharina.
For me, it's the consistency. We have very consistent data for the CKD, for heart failure, for diabetes in all the subgroups. And I think this is something very unique for SGLT2 inhibitors. And this is an important message, I think, that we can really use it and have consistency about subgroups and different disease.
Definitely, definitely. So I think we've got a couple of minutes for repeating 2 and 3 questions. So let's see if you change your mind after this session. That was the question. How far do you go on eGFR when using SGLT2 inhibitors? 45, 30, 20, or until the patient starts renal replacement therapy? Okay, let's vote again. Let's see, we did something today. Well, that changed a lot, definitely. So we will go to 20 or even until patient starts renal replacement therapy. Good, they changed their minds actually. And the last question, do you use SGLT2 inhibitors in patients with low or no albuminuria? Of course, depending on all the factors, some people, genetic background, or no, its usefulness has not been demonstrated in randomized clinical trials. Of course, 60% and 32% depending on other factors, and just a little 8% won't use that in non-albuminuric, non-diabetic patients. So I think we did it. We made it. This EMPA-KIDNEY and all the data in SGLT2 inhibitors, I think they've changed our lives, nephrology community. It's safe, it's good for our patients, it's good for cardiac patients, it's good for nephrology patients, diabetic, non-diabetics, low or not that or high proteinuria. So I think this is a big deal. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and